Christmas is supposed to be the loudest time of the year in our small town. The streets are usually filled with the smell of roasted chestnuts and the sound of children laughing. But this year, the silence in our house was heavy. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It felt like something was holding its breath in the corners of the rooms. My name is Elena. My family lives in an old, two-story wooden house that my grandfather built. We always follow the same traditions every December. We put up the lights, we cook the traditional ham, and we place the star on top of the tree. But on December 21st, 3 days ago, something changed. My younger brother, Paolo, stopped speaking. He didn't look sick. He didn't have a fever. He just sat by the large window in the living room, staring out into the dark pine trees behind our backyard. When my mother tried to call him for dinner, he didn't move. When I touched his shoulder, his skin felt as cold as ice, even though the fireplace was burning bright. "Paolo, what are you looking at?" I asked him that night. He didn't turn his head. He pointed a thin, trembling finger toward the woods. "The guest is coming, Elena. He is bringing the gifts we didn't ask for." I looked out into the trees. There was nothing but shadows and the pale moonlight hitting the snow. But then I saw it. A single, bright red ribbon tied to the branch of the tallest tree. It was waving in the wind, but there was no breeze. It looked like a drop of blood against the dark wood. The next morning, the first gift appeared. It wasn't under the tree. It was sitting right in the middle of the kitchen table when we woke up. It was a small box wrapped in old, yellowed newspaper. There was no name on it. No to or from. Just a thick, silk red ribbon tied in a perfect bow. My father thought it was a prank from the neighbors. He laughed and reached out to tear the paper. "Don't!" Paolo shouted. It was the first time he had spoken in 24 hours. His eyes were wide with terror. "If you open it before the clock strikes 12 on Christmas Eve, the guest gets to take a piece of us." My father paused, his hand hovering over the box. We all looked at each other. The room suddenly felt 10 degrees colder. From inside the small box, we heard a faint, wet scratching sound. It sounded like something small and sharp was trying to dig its way out through the cardboard. My mother stepped back, her face turning pale. "Who put this here?" The doors were locked all night. I looked at the window. The red ribbon in the woods was gone. But when I looked down at the floor, there were wet, muddy footprints leading from Paolo's chair straight to the kitchen table. The footprints were too small to be a man's and too strange to be a child's. They looked like the marks of bare, thin feet with long, claw-like toes. The silence of the house became aggressive. By the second night, my father had decided to throw the mysterious box into the fireplace. He said we wouldn't let a prank ruin our Christmas. But as the flames licked the old newspaper wrapping, the fire didn't turn orange. It turned a sickly, pale green. The scratching sound from inside the box grew into a high-pitched scream, like a dying bird, before the box finally turned to ash. My father tried to act brave, but I saw his hands shaking as he held his coffee mug. "It's just chemicals in the paper," he whispered, mostly to himself. That night, the second gift appeared. This time, it wasn't a box. It was a pair of old, leather shoes sitting at the foot of my parents' bed. They were caked in fresh, dark mud, the kind of mud you only find deep in the swamp behind the pine trees. Tied to the laces was that same bright red ribbon. My mother screamed when she woke up. "Someone is inside the house. Someone is watching us sleep." My father grabbed his flashlight and searched every corner. He checked the attic, the basement, and every closet. Every door was still locked from the inside. Every window was latched. There was no way for anyone to enter. Yet, the smell of rotting leaves and stagnant water was now lingering in their bedroom. I went to find Paolo. He was in the hallway, standing perfectly still. He wasn't looking at the shoes. He was looking at the ceiling. "Paolo, please tell me what's happening," I begged, my voice cracking. He whispered, "The guest has entered the house, Elena. The shoes are for the long walk. He is choosing who will go with him to the woods." I looked up at the ceiling where he was staring. There was a damp spot on the white plaster. It was shaped like a large, distorted hand. It looked like something was pressing down from the attic, trying to push through the wood and the paint. That afternoon, we tried to leave. My father packed us into the car, desperate to get us to a hotel in the next town. But when he turned the key, the engine made a sickening crunching noise. He opened the hood and recoiled in horror. The engine was stuffed with long, black hair. It was tangled around the belts and the battery, wet and smelling of the earth. And tied around the steering wheel was another red ribbon. We were trapped. The Christmas lights on the porch flickered and died, even though it was only 4 in the afternoon. The sun began to set earlier than usual, casting long, jagged shadows across the snow. As the darkness swallowed the house, we heard a rhythmic thumping from the attic. Thump, drag, thump, drag. It sounded like someone was walking upstairs, but they were dragging a heavy weight behind them. "Don't look up," Paolo whispered, his eyes rolling back into his head. "If you see his face before the third gift, he won't wait for Christmas Eve." I looked at my mother. She was staring at the kitchen cupboards. They were all standing wide open. Every single plate and glass had been turned upside down. The third day felt like waking up inside a nightmare that refused to end. The sun never really rose. The sky stayed a bruised, purplish gray. The air inside our house became thick, making it hard to breathe, as if the walls themselves were closing in. My father tried to break the front door down with an axe, but the wood wouldn't splinter. It felt soft, like hitting human flesh. "It's not letting us out," my father whispered, dropping the axe. His eyes were bloodshot. He hadn't slept for 48 hours. Then, we found the third gift. It was sitting on the dining table, right where the first box had been. It was a silver hand mirror, the kind my grandmother used to own. But the glass was cracked in a spiderweb pattern. Tied around the handle was the signature red ribbon, bright and mocking. My mother reached for it, her hand trembling. "This was buried with her," she choked out. "I put this in her coffin myself 3 years ago." I looked into the cracked mirror. I didn't see my own reflection. I saw the hallway behind me, but it looked different. In the mirror, the hallway was dripping with black oil, and the Christmas tree was decorated with human teeth instead of lights. Behind my reflection's shoulder, a tall, thin figure was standing. It had no face, only a smooth surface of pale skin, and it was holding a pair of rusted sewing needles. I spun around. The hallway was empty, but when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer. It was reaching out toward my neck. "Don't look at the truth yet, Elena," Paolo muttered from the corner. He was drawing symbols on the floor with a piece of charred wood. "The guest is showing you the past. He wants you to remember what happened last Christmas." My heart hammered against my ribs. Last Christmas? Everything from last year was a blur. I remembered the snow, the car accident near the pine trees, and the funeral. But whose funeral? Why couldn't I remember the face of the person we buried? Suddenly, the house began to groan. The floorboards beneath our feet started to shift, like a giant ribcage expanding. The smell of rotting lilies, the smell of a wake, filled the kitchen. "We need to leave now," my father shouted, grabbing my mother's hand. He ran toward the back door, but as he stepped into the mudroom, he froze. The floor was gone. In its place was a deep, dark hole that smelled of wet earth and old wood. It looked like an open grave, right in the middle of our house. And from the darkness of that hole, we heard a voice. It wasn't a monster's voice. It was a soft, distorted version of my mother's voice, crying for help from deep underground. But my mother was standing right next to me. She heard it too. She looked at her own hands, and for a second, they looked transparent, like smoke. "Who is in the hole?" I screamed. Paolo didn't look up from his drawings. "The one we left behind in the snow," he said. "The one who didn't get a gift." Outside, the red ribbons were now tied to every single tree in the backyard. Hundreds of them, waving in the silent wind, pointing toward the house. The guest wasn't just coming. He was already hosting the party. The air in the house was now freezing, but the fireplace refused to stay lit. Every time my father struck a match, the flame would be sucked toward the grave in the floor, as if something invisible was inhaling the light. We were all huddled together in the kitchen, the only room that still felt somewhat solid. But solid was a lie. The walls were beginning to weep. A thick, dark liquid was oozing from the wallpaper, smelling of old copper and funeral flowers. If you think this is a simple ghost story, you are wrong. Stay until the end, because the truth about Elena's family is more terrifying than the guest himself. Don't leave yet. The real nightmare is just about to be revealed. That my mother began to hum a Christmas carol, but the tune was off. It was the song she used to sing to my older sister, Maria. But Maria wasn't here. Maria had moved away years ago, hadn't she? I tried to remember Maria's face, but all I could see was the face of the figure in the cracked mirror, the one with the sewing needles. "Why are we here, Dad?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why can't I remember last year?" My father didn't answer. He was staring at the kitchen clock. The hands were moving backward, spinning faster and faster. Every time they passed the number 12, a loud crack echoed through the house, like a bone snapping. Then, the fourth gift appeared. It didn't come in a box or a bag. It fell from the ceiling and landed on the table with a wet thud. It was a heavy, old-fashioned photo album, bound in black leather. Tied around it was the red ribbon, but this time, the ribbon was wet. It wasn't ink. It was fresh blood. Paolo stood up and walked toward the album. His eyes were no longer hollow. They were filled with a strange, glowing light. "This is the bridge," he said. "Once you cross it, there is no going back to the world of the living. You wanted to know why the guest is here? He is here to collect the debt. Wait, before we open this album, ask yourself, why is Paolo the only one who knows the rules?" The answer in part 8 will change everything you've seen so far. Keep watching. My mother screamed as the photo album opened by itself. The pages didn't show photos of holidays or birthdays. They showed us, Elena, Mom, and Dad, standing around a car wreckage in the snow. In the photos, we weren't crying. We were walking away from the car. And inside the car, a girl was screaming, her hand pressed against the glass. A girl with a red ribbon in her hair. "We didn't help her," Paolo whispered. "We were too cold. We were too tired. We just wanted to get home for Christmas." Suddenly, the thumping from the attic stopped. The scratching from the walls ceased. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. Then, a soft knock came from the inside of the photo album. Knock, knock, knock. A pale, blue finger with a sharp nail poked through the paper of the photograph. Then another. Someone was trying to climb out of the memories and into our kitchen. The finger poking through the photo was gray and shriveled, like it had been soaking in water for a long time. Then, another finger appeared, and another, until a whole hand, thin and skeletal, gripped the edge of the photo album. The paper tore with a sound like screaming silk. My father tried to slam the album shut, but the hand was too strong. It grabbed his wrist, and where the cold skin touched him, his flesh turned black instantly. He let out a strangled cry and fell back, staring at his arm in horror. "It's her," my mother whispered, her voice trembling. "Maria, we thought you were. We thought you didn't make it." The figure slowly pulled itself out of the book. It wasn't a girl anymore. It was a tall, twisted shape wrapped in a burial shroud that was once a white Christmas dress. Her hair was a matted, frozen mess of black strands, and a red ribbon was tied tightly around her neck, so tight it had cut into the skin. She had no eyes, only empty sockets that leaked a dark, salty fluid. "The guest is not a stranger, Mother," the entity croaked. The voice sounded like ice breaking. "The guest is the memory you tried to bury in the snow." Suddenly, the kitchen lights exploded. Shards of glass rained down on us, but they didn't fall to the floor. They stayed suspended in the air, glowing with a ghostly light. In the reflection of every tiny piece of glass, I saw the same scene. December 24th, last year. The car was upside down. The smell of gasoline was everywhere. I saw myself. I was standing in the snow, holding my arm. My father was pulling my mother away from the wreckage. "We have to go," he was shouting in the memory. "The car is going to explode. We can't save her." But Maria was still alive. I saw her hand pressing against the window, her fingers wearing the same red ribbon I had given her that morning. She wasn't stuck. The door was jammed, but we didn't even try to pull it. We were so afraid, so cold, that we ran into the woods to find help. But we never looked back. "You left me to the cold," the figure of Maria said, stepping onto the kitchen floor. Each step she took left a puddle of freezing meltwater. "You reached the house. You sat by the fire. You ate your dinner while the frost turned my blood into needles." Paolo walked toward her. He wasn't afraid. He reached out and touched the red ribbon around her neck. "They forgot, Maria. They chose to forget so they could live. But the guest always brings the truth for Christmas." The house began to shake violently. The walls started to peel away, revealing not the outdoors, but a vast, endless forest of dark pine trees. Our home was disappearing, dissolving into the very woods where Maria had died. "Where is the guest, Maria?" I screamed, falling to my knees. "Is it you? Are you the guest?" She tilted her head, a sickening crack echoing from her neck. "I am just the gift. The guest is already behind you." I turned around, and my heart stopped. Standing in the doorway was a figure 10 feet tall, made entirely of twisted red ribbons. It had no face, only a giant, rusted pair of sewing needles where its eyes should have been. The guest didn't move like a human. It shifted like a mass of snakes, the red ribbons that made up its body slithering over each other with a sound like dry autumn leaves. It stood so tall that its head, the one with the rusted needles for eyes, was pressed against the kitchen ceiling. My father tried to scream, but as the guest tilted its head toward him, the sound died in his throat. The guest raised a long, thin arm made of tangled silk and touched my father's chest. The red ribbon didn't just touch his shirt. It sank into his skin like a needle through fabric. "Dad," I cried out, but my voice felt far away. My father's body began to jerk violently. He wasn't being hit. He was being sewn. The guest was moving its fingers with lightning speed, stitching my father's mouth shut with thick, red thread. No blood came out. Only the smell of old, frozen pine needles. My father's eyes went wide with agony, but he could no longer make a sound. "The guest is the tailor of sorrows," Maria's ghost whispered, her voice echoing from the corners of the dissolving room. "He mends the holes that families leave behind. You left a hole in our family when you let me freeze. Now he will fix it." The walls of our house were almost gone now. We weren't in our kitchen anymore. We were standing in the middle of the snowy woods, the very place where the accident happened. The car was there, upside down and blackened by fire. But instead of one girl inside, I saw 3 empty seats waiting. My mother fell to her knees, sobbing. We were scared. We were just human. The guest turned toward her. It didn't care about excuses. It reached out its other hand, and hundreds of red ribbons unspooled from its palms, wrapping around my mother's limbs like cocoons. She tried to crawl away, but the ribbons were stitching her clothes directly to the frozen earth. "Paolo, stop this." I turned to my little brother, but he was standing next to Maria, holding her cold, gray hand. "I can't stop the guest, Elena," Paolo said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I am the one who invited him. I couldn't live with the secret anymore. I prayed every night for someone to come and fix what we broke." The guest heard me. I looked at the guest. It was now looking at me. Those rusted needles were pointed straight at my heart. I realized then that the gifts weren't warnings. They were pieces of us that the guest had already taken while we were sleeping over the last few days. The shoes, the mirror, the photo album, they were all anchors, pulling us back to the moment we committed our greatest sin. The guest took a step toward me. The snow beneath its feet didn't melt. It turned red. "Wait," I gasped, backing away toward the wreckage of the car. "If you take us, who will remember Maria? Who will tell the story?" Maria's faceless head tilted. "The story is already written in the snow, Elena, and the guest loves a complete ending." The guest moved closer, and the sound of its body was no longer like leaves. It was like 1,000 whispers of people who had been forgotten. The rusted needles in its face began to glow with a dull, rhythmic light, pulsing like a dying heart. I backed away until my heels hit the cold metal of the overturned car. "Please," I whispered, but my breath came out as a red mist. The cold was no longer outside. It was starting from inside my own chest. The guest raised its hand, and the red ribbons exploded outward, wrapping around my waist. They weren't soft. They were sharp, like piano wire, cutting through my coat and into my skin. I wasn't being pulled toward the guest. I was being pulled into the car wreckage. I looked at my father. He was no longer moving. He was standing perfectly still, his mouth sewn shut, his eyes staring at nothing. The guest had turned him into a living doll, a decoration for this twisted Christmas. My mother was next. The ribbons had completely covered her, forming a red cocoon that pulsed with her muffled screams. "Maria, make it stop," I yelled, looking at my sister's ghost. Maria stood next to Paolo, her hollow sockets leaking black fluid. "The guest doesn't stop, Elena. He only finishes. You wanted a perfect Christmas, didn't you? You wanted us all to be together again. This is the only way." Paolo stepped forward. He wasn't a victim. He was the witness. "The debt must be paid in full, Elena. One life for one life was never the deal. It was a family for a family." The guest let out a sound, a low, vibrating hum that made the trees around us shatter like glass. The dark forest was closing in. The snow was now up to my knees, and it was warm, like blood. I felt the guest's fingers, those long, silken threads, touching my forehead. "You were the one who suggested we leave." The guest's voice finally spoke. It wasn't one voice. It was the voices of my father, my mother, and Maria, all speaking at once. You were the one who said Maria was already gone. You lied to save yourself. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I remembered now. I wasn't just standing there. I had seen Maria's hand moving. I had heard her whisper my name. And I had turned my back because I was cold. I was the one who told Dad to drive away. The red ribbon around my waist tightened, pulling me through the broken window of the car. The jagged glass tore at my clothes, but I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the crushing weight of the guest's presence. "One more stitch," the guest whispered. I looked up and saw the guest's face opening. Beneath the ribbons, there was no skull, no flesh, only an endless void filled with millions of red ribbons, waiting to sew the world shut. The interior of the car was freezing, smelling of burnt rubber and old blood. As I was pulled inside, the guest leaned over the wreckage. Its face, that void of red silk, pressed against the broken windshield. "The guest doesn't take lives, Elena," Maria's voice whispered from the darkness outside. "The guest only returns what was lost." Suddenly, the world stopped shaking. The red ribbons around my body loosened. I looked at my hands. They were pale, blue, and covered in frost. I looked at my clothes. I wasn't wearing my warm winter coat anymore. I was wearing a white Christmas dress, now torn and stained. I looked out the window. There, standing in the snow, were three figures. My father, my mother, and me. Not the me that was inside the car, but another Elena. She was holding her arm, looking at the wreckage with wide, terrified eyes. "We have to go," the Elena in the snow shouted. "The car is going to explode. We can't save her." I tried to scream, to tell them I was still alive, but my mouth was sewn shut with red thread. I hammered my fists against the glass, but no sound came out. I watched as my family, my real, living family, turned their backs and ran into the dark woods, leaving me behind in the freezing metal trap. Then, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned around. Sitting in the back seat was Paolo, but he wasn't the little brother I knew. He was a small, wooden doll with buttons for eyes, tied together with red ribbons. "You see, Elena," the doll whispered. "You never went home last year. None of us did." The truth hit me like a physical blow. The house, the gifts, the last few days, it was all a shared hallucination created by the guest. We didn't die in the car accident. We died after it. My father had frozen to death trying to find the road. My mother had collapsed in the snow a mile away. And I had stayed in the car, waiting for a rescue that never came. Only Paolo had survived. The real Paolo was currently in a hospital bed, miles away, in a coma. The Paolo we saw in the house was just a fragment of his memory, a bridge the guest used to bring us all back together one last time. The guest wasn't a monster. The guest was the personification of our collective guilt. It had gathered our wandering, frozen souls and brought us back to the place where it all ended, so we wouldn't have to be alone on Christmas. "It's time to open the final gift," Maria said, appearing in the seat next to me. She looked beautiful again, no longer a ghost, but wearing her favorite red ribbon. The guest reached into the car and handed me a small, glowing star. As I touched it, the cold disappeared. The smell of smoke vanished. For a second, I felt the warmth of a fireplace and heard the sound of distant carols. Outside the car, the guest began to unravel. The millions of red ribbons flew into the air, dancing like sparks from a fire, until they covered the entire forest. The trees, the snow, and the wreckage all began to fade into a soft, white light. The last thing I saw before the light swallowed me was the real Paolo. He was waking up in a hospital room. A nurse was putting a small, red ribbon on a tiny Christmas tree by his bed. He looked at the window and smiled, as if he could see us waving goodbye. We weren't trapped anymore. We were just finished. The guest had sewn the story shut. Have you ever experienced a Christmas nightmare? Share your real horror story in the comments below. I will be pinning the most terrifying one to the top. Don't forget to like and subscribe. The guest is watching.